You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 14th of December 2021 on Monocle 24. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Hello, this is The Globalist, live from Midori House in London. I'm Georgina Godwin. Coming up, Israel's Prime Minister Naftali Bennett has made his first official visit to the UAE. We'll explore the significance of ties between Abu Dhabi and Tel Aviv. Also ahead, Donald Trump's former political aide, Mark Meadows, is in trouble over his refusal to cooperate with the investigation into the Capitol Hill riot.
We are here to address a very serious matter: contempt of Congress by a former chief of staff to a former president of the United States.
Plus a review of the day's papers, the latest urbanism news, and we find out about our enduring fascination with Christmas ghost stories.
We know that people were telling ghost stories right back in the 17th century and before then, but they weren't fiction in the way that we know it today.
That's all ahead here on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in the news. The World Health Organization says the Omicron coronavirus variant poses a very high global risk, with growing evidence that it evades vaccine protection. The Tunisian President Kais Saied has announced that he will call a constitutional referendum in July, which is a year after he seized sweeping powers in a political coup. And Chanel has named the winners of its inaugural Chanel Next Prize, a new award aimed at supporting international creatives. For more, head to monocle.com/minute. And do stay tuned to Monocle 24 throughout the day for more on those stories. Now, Naftali Bennett, Israel's Prime Minister, has met with the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi as part of the first official visit to the United Arab Emirates by an Israeli leader since the establishment of official relations between the two countries last year. Alison Kaplan-Sommer is a journalist from Haaretz, and she joins me down the line from Tel Aviv now. Alison, good morning to you. How far is this meeting a legacy of Donald Trump?
Well, good morning, first of all, and it's absolutely a legacy of Donald Trump. On the surface, this meeting was, historic. It went smoothly, and it is based on celebrating and aspiring to expand the economic relationship and the diplomatic relationship and the exchange of tourism between the two countries, which wouldn't have been possible at all without the Abraham Accords, which is 100% a diplomatic accomplishment of the Trump administration.
And if Trump enabled the meeting, he also exacerbated the primary problem the two met to discuss. That's the threat of Iranian nuclear capability. Tell us more.
Well, absolutely. Like I said, on the surface, this historic visit was a celebration, the first visit by an Israeli prime minister to one of the Gulf states, the first celebration of a peace between Israel and an Arab country in, over a quarter of a century, over 25 years. So that was sort of kind of on the surface. And publicly, neither of the leaders mentioned the word Iran. And obviously, they did not either mention the word Palestinians. But behind the scenes, under the surface, the Iran issue was very much there, and yes, it was influenced and exacerbated by the decision of Donald Trump to pull out of the Iran agreement and sort of throw all of the cards up in the air in terms of what the world is going to do, and specifically what Israel is going to do about Iran's continuing move towards becoming a nuclear power.
So the Israeli Prime Minister has called for nuclear talks to be halted, and he accuses Tehran of nuclear blackmail. Why does he say that, and does the UAE agree?
Well, the UAE's goal in the matter is to keep as much regional stability happening as possible, and to keep, obviously, economic activity thriving. The under the cover agenda of Naftali Bennett is to try to get the UAE to pull away from its relative warming of ties recently between the UAE and Iran. They signed an agreement a couple of years ago with economic cooperation with Iran, and the UAE strongly opposes any kind of military action against Iran, again wanting the region to be stable. So while they both view Iran as a threat, Israel and the UAE have very different ideas of how strongly those moves should be made and what should be done. Even the United States has problems with the UAE's relationship with Iran. They are trying to make the UAE make its sanctions against Iran tighter because right now Iran is freely using UAE banking services.
So in terms of Bennett and this being a sort of celebration, he talked about the visit being a new reality for the region. How so?
It is absolutely a new reality. Listen, since the Abraham Accords, we've had 250,000 Israelis, despite COVID, right, taking vacations in the Gulf and in the UAE, visiting Dubai as a favorite destination. We have direct flights now between Bahrain and Israel and the UAE and Israel, as well as countries like Morocco that didn't exist before. So it is absolutely a new reality that is a very good one for Israel and a very unhappy one for the Palestinians.
What else was on the agenda?
Well, it was mostly, like I said, I think that behind the scenes, it was all about Iran, and it was all about the support or not support of the UAE for Israel's cooperation. But there was a lot of economic ties, a lot of discussing of bolstering economic ties, giving additional content to the Abraham Accords, and Bennett said publicly he wants this not only to be a peace between leaders, but a peace between people. So development of programs that would get the people in the UAE and Israel to form warmer ties, to have it defined as a warm peace and not as Israel has a cold peace with Egypt and Jordan, in which there is officially peace between the two countries, but there's very little warmth or friendship between the countries as a whole.
And do you think that it will have an impact on the people on the ground? I remember being in Dubai, and Israel is not even on the map there. So clearly things like that have to change.
But this is step by step, and the steps that were precipitated by the Abraham Accords have been a huge leap forward, and I don't think that we can completely judge the level and desire of exchanges between the two countries, both economically and in terms of tourism. Remember, this has all happened in a pandemic, so it's been hampered by that. So we can see, if hopefully someday when this pandemic ebbs as a block, then we could see the ties between the two countries develop even more fully.
Well, speaking of the pandemic, Bennett's been under fire at home for a recent trip that he and his family took abroad amid COVID travel restrictions. So how is this meeting playing domestically? Is this the classic dead cat?
Well, very specifically, you made a little bit of an error in your description. It was not a trip by he and his family. It was a trip by his wife and children. He stayed home. He didn't make it a secret that he was not exactly supportive of the decision of his wife to take the trip, and his advisors very publicly said that they did not advise her to publicly take the trip. And yes, there was a great deal of public resentment because Bennett himself advised the country not to travel, and then there was his wife and children heading off for a resort. So I don't think it was on the level of trouble that Boris Johnson is getting at the moment for the revelation of his parties, but there was definitely a lot of grumbling and a lot of joke making at Bennett's expense for being accused of being led around by the nose by his wife. And
are there those in Israel, in the political establishment, who still question the legitimacy of his leadership?
I think after 6 months, he's just marked 6 months in office. I think only the most hardcore supporters of the former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu will say any kind of word about legitimacy. I think that, at this point, it's normalized that Naftali Bennett is Prime Minister, even though, with this weird configuration of parties that he's leading in the government, and his party itself is very small. I don't think his legitimacy is being questioned, but you can't deny that he is Prime Minister of a country with sort of unprecedented weak level of political support from within his own party, and the clock is ticking. Very soon, he is supposed to rotate that position with Yair Lapid, and so that kind of undermines his legitimacy in terms of how much he can promise in any kind of long-term planning.
Alison, thank you very much indeed. That's Alison Kaplan-Sommer, and this is The Globalist on Monocle 24. The US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has begun a Southeast Asian tour aimed at strengthening ties in the region. Gwen Robinson is Monocle's Bangkok correspondent, and she joins me on the line now. Gwen, why is Southeast Asia so important to Washington?
Well, I think two things. One is clearly that the US under President Joe Biden is trying to undo some of the damage done over some years of Donald Trump, where relations with Southeast Asia, I think, really reached pretty well rock bottom. Trump never attended a summit with the ASEAN countries, and I think the relationship had overall soured. So Biden knew very well that there was some damage control to do. And second, I think the US is clearly very alarmed at the huge leaps and bounds China has been making in its relations with both individual ASEAN countries. There's 10 Southeast Asian countries in ASEAN, and also bilaterally. So clearly, Blinken is on a charm offensive. And
which countries is he visiting, and why were those countries chosen?
Yes, that's a very good question. I guess, basically they're starting with a clean slate. The US Secretary of State has never been to the region physically. So, several key ones are as good as any, I guess. But it makes absolute sense to kick off his tour with Indonesia. So Blinken has started with Indonesia. He's been there for 2 days now and is moving on to Malaysia and then finishing the trip in Thailand, where he's due on Thursday. So why Indonesia? It is the seat of ASEAN. The secretariat is there. So that makes absolute sense. And then Blinken himself has mentioned in previous remarks about Indonesia that it is the third most populous country, and also what he didn't say is it's the third most populous population of Muslims. So I think for various reasons it does make sense. And moving on to Malaysia and Thailand, both are countries where there is a great deal of concern, I think, in the West at their drift closer to China. And right now, the terrible violence we've been seeing in Myanmar next door to Thailand has also prompted, I think, concern in Washington and an effort to perhaps win the ties over to take more of a sympathetic view to the Western stance of trying to isolate Myanmar's military junta.
And do you think it's significant that Thailand was excluded from the Democracy Summit in December, and he's now making a point of visiting?
Well, that is also an extremely good point. We saw I think it's about 110 countries invited to this extraordinary virtual democracy summit presided over by Biden. And actually quite a few of the ASEAN countries were not included. Understandably, I guess, would be the two communist countries, Laos and Vietnam. But as for two very conspicuous absences in the ASEAN group in the Democracy Summit, Thailand and Singapore both tend to regard themselves as kind of democracies. They have elections. They're, not human rights abusers to the point where we're seeing what's happening in Myanmar. And I think they were fairly peeved at being excluded, but put on a brave face and said it would probably be more trouble than it was worth to be invited. So I think it did rankle, and Thailand has a greater sense of faith, of its reputation than Singapore, which shrugged it off probably gladly. So I think that does pose a little bit more damage control for Blinken to do, assure the ties that they are very important, that the US values the relationship, and, of course, to remind, across the border on the other side of Thailand is Cambodia, where the relationship with China is so close that I think various US officials have registered alarm at that, and right now there are lots of reports of China building military facilities in Cambodia, which has been sort of denied, but it's clear that Chinese construction companies are in there shoring up a military base there. So that's quite a bit on Blinken's plate to push in a charm offensive with Thailand.
And has he given any detail on the US Indo-Pacific strategy as a whole?
Well, he did. He's just given a keynote speech this morning in Jakarta before he moves on to Malaysia. And he did bill Indonesia, as he was very, obviously it makes sense that he was very flattering about Indonesia's role and its importance, and made it clear that the US was going to upgrade its engagement with the region and saw Indonesia as key to stability in the Indo-Pacific, and has also mentioned hopes to strengthen relationship on specific issues such as infrastructure. So really appealing to Indonesia's desire for more foreign investment and clearly implying that more would come from this. And also mentioned vaccine strategy. Indonesia, which doesn't have a great relationship with China, came much closer recently with China's largesse handing out vaccines to the Indonesians. So I think Blinken did stress that, and a couple of other things like climate change and Indonesia's cooperation. So that was unmistakably a big push to both emphasize the importance of the Indo-Pacific strategy to the Americans and the role of these key ASEAN countries in it. And that was, I think, his keynote speech of the trip.
So, I mean, traditionally, US engagement with the ASEAN nations has concentrated on military ties. This is clearly a slight change of focus, looking at economy, infrastructure and so on. How achievable, though, is it for the US to get involved at that level, given China's huge economic heft in the region?
Yes, that is really a very relevant point to make. How easy is it? Well, clearly this Blinken trip follows an extraordinary string of high-level visits to this region. Actually, in the last few months, we've had, the U.S. Defense Secretary, Commerce, the U.S. Trade Representative, a bunch of State Department top people, and even the commander of the Indo-Pacific Command. So on all fronts, economic, military, and even social, and a lot more largesse from the U.S. So there is both promises of more funding and support on various programs across a range of things, and also some actual funding and support kicking through. So I think possibly, or rather definitely, it's clear that the US thinks it can fight back or counter China's growing grip by paying a lot more attention, making the Asians feel loved, throwing some money, and as you say, broadening the agenda beyond just a security focus and an urge to support us, we're your big ally, to broader things, including help on climate change, vaccine, pandemic management, and infrastructure. And most of all, the bottom line is investment. And we've also seen some very big groups coming through from the US business community, with a very big one recently in Thailand, which has also swung through the region. So clearly, I think it's a multi-point offensive, charm offensive that we're going to see more of going ahead.
I mean, does this put ASEAN nations in an invidious position? Are countries like Thailand, for instance, worried about being forced to choose between the US and China?
Yes, you hit the nail on the head. That has even been stated not just by the Thais but various officials in the region, more really not resentfully but more to explain a position that they do not want to be in a position where they are being forced to choose. And ironically, though predictably, I suppose, senior Chinese and American officials and leaders have often repeated that, we are not forcing anyone to choose. But clearly these kind of competing charm offensives, competing offers of aid and support are actually making countries of the region feel they're forced to choose. Let's also say that this ongoing crisis in Myanmar, where a whole country is imploding and rapidly becoming a failed state, does also present some dilemmas for ASEAN, whether to keep Myanmar in its grouping or kick it out, which would be unprecedented. And there's a lot of pressure from China to carry on, keep Myanmar in the group, versus the US, where I think it hasn't been made clear so far on the Blinken visit, but it's understood that behind the scenes there's a lot of pressure from the US on ASEAN leaders to further isolate Myanmar's junta. And I think the role of a pariah state in the group would also be key to that. ASEAN has to have a good, long, hard look at itself as well. I don't think, though, in the end, ASEAN really has to choose one or the other in terms of China versus the US. If they were really smart, they'd be playing more of both against each other. And I think some of the savvier countries are doing that.
Gwen, thank you very much indeed. That was Monocle's Bangkok correspondent, Gwen Robinson. Now, still to come on the programme, Alessia Patalano reviews the day's papers, we get the latest urbanism news, and we explore our enduring fascination with the ghosts of Christmas past. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
Last night, the Congressional Committee investigating the January the 6th insurrection voted unanimously to recommend criminal contempt charges against Donald Trump's former Chief of Staff, Mark Meadows, for refusing to testify about the event. Well, let's get the latest now with the US political expert and regular Monocle 24 contributor, Scott Lucas. Thanks for joining us, Scott. Meadows had been cooperating, and then he refused to appear for a scheduled deposition last week or to turn over additional documents. Why? Was there a change of heart?
Well, the statement from Mark Meadows' lawyer, George Terwilliger, cited a general invocation of executive privilege, even though judges have said that Donald Trump, Mark Meadows' boss, does not have executive privilege since he's no longer in office. And certainly Mark Meadows, who is no longer White Chief of Staff, doesn't have that. Nevertheless, Terwilliger cited as a catalyst that the committee was pursuing cell phone records, mobile phone records, for Meadows and indeed for others, and said this was not appropriate. Something, of course, that the committee rejected and said, yes, mobile phone records are essential to their investigation. Behind that official explanation, as it were, from Terwilliger, probably two factors. One is that Donald Trump has ordered all of his former staff, including Steve Bannon, who is now facing contempt charges, including Jeffrey Clark, the Justice Department official, facing contempt charges, not to testify or give over documents. And secondly, look, there's still a chance that Mark Meadows, unless he has immunity from prosecution, we don't know if the committee's proceedings will lead to other criminal charges if they find there was collaboration between members of the Trump camp and those involved in the attack of the Capitol on January the 6th.
I mean, there's already an astonishing amount of evidence out there, though. Can you tell us about some of the texts, the tweets, the phone calls that have come to light?
Yes, I mean, there's an immediate story and then a wider one. So the immediate one, which is, look, January 6th, there's hundreds of people who are attacking the U.S. Capitol, who are threatening to execute legislators and Vice President Mike Pence. Well, we've got text messages on the day, including some cited by the committee, where you had people appealing to Mark Meadows, saying, look, please get Donald Trump to speak out against this. One of those text messages, which has filled with expletives, is from Donald Trump Jr., saying, look, we have to stop this. Fox TV host who had supported Trump's lies, let's be honest what they were, about a stolen election, they're still appealing to Meadows, saying, look, Trump's legacy, whatever that is, will be destroyed if he doesn't come out and speak against the attacks. You then have text messages running up to the attack, which indicate that Mark Meadows was in contact with organizers of the January 6th rallies, the Stop the Steal rally, And there is a message which it is claimed, and I must say that we need more context on this, a message which indicates there may have been an attempt before the January 6th rally to make sure that the National Guard did not intervene too quickly, or in other words, let's put it a different way, protected Trump supporters on the day of those events.
And I mean, these messages also implicate many other people.
I mean, the fact of the matter is that we have got a series of organizers who are named in the text messages. Now, they may not have directly called for violence on January the 6th, but the rallies may have set up, as it were, the foundation for those attacks. We have got speakers alongside Donald Trump, including his attorney, Rudy Giuliani, including Representative Mo Brooks from Alabama, who made inflammatory statements to the crowd. We have got legislators who were giving tours to people just before the attack, and those people happened to be among the attackers on January the 6th. But Georgina, remember, this isn't just about January the 6th, that we've got messages which go back weeks and months about the extent of Trump's efforts to overturn the election, which include pressure and threats on state officials. Who was included? Who was involved in that Trump campaign against state officials? Mark Meadows. We have got Trump's disinformation, which actually is saying, look, you have to seat my electors because Joe Biden's electors weren't legally elected. Who was involved in that effort? Also Mark Meadows.
I mean, this clearly then goes to the very heart of the Trump administration.
Well, it goes to the heart of the Trump circle. And let's distinguish between two things. That you've got people in the administration. You've got people, say, in the Defense Department, say, in the State Department, say, in the Homeland Security Department, who are very concerned on January the 6th about what might happen. You've got General Mark Milley, America's top military commander, who will later say that Trump was looking for his Reichstag moment. That referenced Adolf Hitler seizing power in the 1930s in Germany. But then you have Trump's inner circle. You have got people that were around him who, at the very least, were aiding and abetting the effort on all fronts, the failed legal attempts, the tweets, the calls to the state legislators, the attempts to replace the attorney general to put in a loyalist. Also, he could cling on to power despite the fact that he had lost that November election. This was, Georgina, in other words, an attempted coup.
So what happens next?
The House committee continues its work. Remember, it's not just Mark Meadows or Steve Bannon. The committee has heard from scores of people who have willingly testified. It has documents from those people. This is a sweeping investigation, which will take some further time to proceed. So while Mark Meadows and Steve Bannon and Jeffrey Clark probably will all fight their contempt charges to avoid conviction, the committee will be compiling its report, its investigation. Now, that investigation could lead to further action by the House. Could it lead to wider criminal charges which would be in connection with an attempt to seize power on January the 6th through violence? That we wait to see. You know, I've said for years, Donald Trump's a lucky man to avoid prison. Well, I'm not saying he's going to prison over this, but there are those around him who might want to have a glance over their shoulders every once in a while.
And I mean, does this mean then that he's going to lose the power he holds over the Republican Party? Is he now irrelevant? Can he possibly stand again?
Has he lost his power over the Republican Party? Absolutely not. Will he stand again, including for president in 2024? Probably. In other words, what's most striking about this is then what is the biggest threat to American democracy since the U.S. Civil War, that they're still in a divided country, a polarized country, in which disinformation often trumps facts, in which threats often trump dialogue, that Donald Trump will, for the time being, escape accountability because the Republicans in the House, certainly, and many Republicans in the Senate will take the knee before him. Why do they take the knee before him? Because they either see the advantage in doing so or because they're scared of their own political futures if they come out and say, we choose American democracy over Donald John Trump.
Scott, thank you very much indeed. That was the US political expert, Scott Lucas. And here's what else we're keeping an eye on today. The World Health Organization says the Omicron coronavirus variant poses a very high global risk, with growing evidence that it evades vaccine protection. The WHO added that clinical data on Omicron severity is still limited, but that its increased transmissibility could have severe consequences. The Tunisian President Kais Saied has announced that he will call a constitutional referendum in July, which is a year after he seized sweeping powers in a political coup. Saied also used his televised address to say that Tunisians will head to the polls towards the end of 2022. And today's Monocle Minute reports on the enduring appeal of the Guinness World Records. You can find out why the must-have Christmas gift continues to top book charts in many countries around the world by heading to monocle.com/minute or by downloading this week's edition of The Stack. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. And now to the Finnish capital, Helsinki, where Monocle's editorial director, Tyler Brûlé, sits down with the CEO of Posti, the Finnish postal service, Turkka Kuusisto. Together they look at the future of logistics and the power of physical innovation. Here's an excerpt of their chat.
We are in the Christmas period, but if we just look back over the last 20 months, what has that meant in terms of just cardboard packages, boxes coming via e-com through people's letterboxes, in their remote pickup boxes? What type of volume increase has this meant for Posti?
It has been a double-digit volume development throughout the whole pandemic, and I remember it like it was yesterday, the second week of March 2020, and all of a sudden we reached, over a couple of weeks, the traditional peak season volumes of 1 million parcels per week, and ever since we've been on that level. And then when we faced the first peak season during the pandemic time, the volumes were like doubled. So it has been really stretching the scalability of our platform, but I need to send my recognition to whole Posti organization that they have done tremendous job in terms of scaling up for this volume growth.
Our listeners and readers will know that we've covered the story once or twice, but you've delivered something very interesting in the center of Helsinki. It's a concept called Box. It sits amongst really the best retailers, globally recognized retail brands, and you've created a space out the back of Stockmann department store where, of course, you can go and pick up a delivery that might have come from any corner of the world, and you can go and pick it up out of a box with a code. And that's maybe not so unique or so different. But you've thought about really the entire supply chain. Often we know that, especially in COVID times, people added on maybe a few too many kilos. You thought that you were a medium, but now you might even be an extra large, but you still ordered the medium. You need to send that item back. And then we're in this environment in your post office with beautiful lighting, great dressing rooms, full mirrors. And then you have the ability, of course, then on the spot to go and send it back as well. So here I want to talk about innovation. What was the thinking there? Because it's quite remarkable. I'm interested in the lessons that have been learned. And where do you see that concept going? Does this become, at a time when we see post offices closing down all over the world, is this also how the post office maybe starts to come back into the community in an interesting way?
Box by Posti was a very interesting project when we initiated it, and it really boils down to some extent even reinventing the e-commerce experience. And for us, putting more effort behind the customer centricity has been the key driver in our new strategy. And thereby we wanted to also look into that, what can we do differently to promote e-commerce and the shopping experience, or the pickup experience, to be a bit more precise. And thereby we decided to go all in, to do the next generation flagship store in the middle of Helsinki, to provide services around sustainability, fitting rooms, a lot of personnel to assist our customers. And all in all, when we look into innovation, you need to have all the digital components, but in our world, it is very much also what comes to real-life processes and manual work, and also people involved. And for instance, when we are deploying our new services, what comes to next-day deliveries, whether they are for parcel locker stations that we, by the way, happen to have more than 2,000 in Finland alone, and the next generation home delivery concept that we came up with the spring of this year was something that the organization was capable of innovating parallel with the traditional, operations and processes, and all of a sudden we were capable of implementing a completely new process with increased customer value, improved customer experience, including the physical and digital components. So in logistics, it's always about combining the physical with digital.
When you look across the world, who do you admire in the logistics space? Do you look to Asia and say, wow, the Singapore Post have got it right? Do you look at the US Postal Service? Are there gold standards? I think for a lot of people probably listening today, waiting for their packages in this Christmas period. Would you say, is there sort of a top three, the luxury group of postal players?
There are many very good postal companies around the world, and this is an easy business to go to meet them because we are not competing globally. We are rather domestic businesses, so we are exchanging information also between the different postal companies. But if I was to select a postal company, I would mention PostNL from the Netherlands. In many ways, they've been rather successful when it comes to managing the transformation that all postal companies are undergoing. The digitalization driving the letter volume down, and then the e-commerce growing up, at the same time facing obviously very diverse competition. And in that quest, I think that PostNL has locally done a great job in terms of managing the traditional mail business and then growing their parcel business within the e-commerce.
As we are approaching Christmas Eve, any special learnings from your friend with the white beard in Rovaniemi? I'm wondering, does he have a seat on the board of Posti?
Not yet, but we have a specific Santa Claus post office in Rovaniemi, so he's a very integrated player within the team.
That was Monocle's editorial director Tyler Brûlé in conversation with the CEO of Posti, Turkka Kuusisto. To hear more, tune in to The Chiefs at 1300 London time today, or you can read this story in print and more in our winter newspaper, which is out now. Do head to monocle.com to find out more. Well, let's continue now with today's newspapers. And joining me down the line is Alessio Patalano, Professor at King's College, London. Alessio, good morning to you. Are you not here because you're worried you might be infected or indeed get infected with this new rampant Omicron virus?
Good morning, Georgina. Indeed, things are changing quite fast, and then they will continue to do so over the next few days. Also, the health secretary has been telling us basically within less than a week, you'll have Omicron overtaking Delta as the primary variant circulating in the UK. And so at the moment, it would appear that certainly the UK will become again a place whereby the future of Europe in many respects is being tested out. Over the next few days, there will be also a massive increase on the vaccination campaign, which seems to be the main approach taken. And obviously, the Prime Minister today will have a really hard time in Parliament with a new package of measures that he wants to go through. So we're looking at a situation over the next few days, just ahead of Christmas, whereby pretty much everything we know about COVID and in the way that it has evolved over the past few months might be tested, challenged, and indeed become very old very quickly.
And I mean, there have been a couple of big infrastructure problems. So, for instance, lateral flow tests don't seem to be available at the moment, from at least free from government sources. And also the website to book booster shots kept crashing yesterday.
Yes, and that is in part due to this incredible change over the weekend in terms of number of infections, and as it often happens in this kind of situation, you have a massive increase in the demand, and then the system cannot cope in the same way it was just a few days ago. So you mentioned two of the most important issues that we're facing at the moment, and again, this is a part of the reason why this new figure of 200,000 infections a day, which are projected to be the average now over the next few days, is coming really as the big news of the day, covered pretty much by any newspaper in the UK, because what's going to happen is that with the temporary lapse in supply of lateral flow tests, which had become an important companion of our daily life in order to keep things going with some measure of normality. And now it's going to be tested. And then on the other, yesterday we've heard, and the news today is covering how thousands of people have been trying to get their booster jabs, which remains the main defense against the virus. So we'll have to see how over the next few days, particularly now that Christmas is coming up, the situation will hold. As we know, supply chains have been already quite strained for a while, so this might put even a bit more of a tension, in addition to the nature of the variant itself, which of course, as we all know, spreads more rapidly. So that will be this, if you want, this convergence of different factors to compound the effects of what likely is going to be Christmas in the UK.
Now, one country that really took very, very strong measures against coronavirus was Australia, sealing off its borders, not letting anybody in or out. There was an exception, though. The South Korean President Moon Jae-in has been to Australia, and he and the Australian leader have signed a key defence pact. Tell us about that.
Georgina, you actually, that is quite true. I mean, Australia has had really really rigid regulations in terms of going in and out, but we know this was the first foreign leader to visit Australia since COVID pandemic began. Also, the first South Korean leader to make a state visit to Australia in 12 years. So it was quite important. And I'm sure that the audience has followed the last few days. Moon was talking about yesterday about the prospect of signing, ending the hostilities and ending the armistice over the Korean peninsula between North and South. And so today we have this new announcement of the largest defense purchase ever conducted by Australia with an Asian country. Now, both Australia and South Korea are two very strong allies of the United States. But the key difference, of course, between Australia and South Korea is that because of President Moon's top priority agenda, which is improving North-South relations, he's also, and he's understanding that China is very important in his corner to make that happen. He's also been very cautious in the way he approached moves taken. So, for example, to the increasing number of states that are joining the United States, and the UK for that matter, in the diplomatic boycott of the Olympic Games, South Korea still hasn't pronounced itself. Now, having said so, on the other hand, that's why it's also quite important, the announcement yesterday in which the South Korean defense industry will provide about 30 units of a self-propelled howitzer and an armored ammunition resupply vehicles to the Australian military. And I think it's very much a sign in this context of how Australia is still trying to prove and demonstrate to everybody, and first and foremost the United States, they remain a close allies and the partner that wants to be considered firmly in the American camp as things become more complicated in the Indo-Pacific security landscape.
Absolutely. Lots of stories here to do with that. For instance, the British government or members of the government are saying that the Navy needs to build more warships to counter future threats. Presumably that's also to do with China. But the story that I would really like you to end on is this extraordinary one of making Elon Musk Time Magazine's Person of the Year. Hugely controversial.
Absolutely, hugely controversial, and it's the sort of thing that will sort of raise and has raised quite a few eyebrows. We all know that, and in a way, it's about all the complexities of societies today. I mean, so the Guardian covered the story quite nicely because it highlights how many have criticized this choice. But in a way, the controversial nature of the super billionaire says something about where we are today as societies, if you want, at this very point in time. Elon Musk's Tesla's company now is the more profitable company on the planet, and in fact he has overtaken Jeff Bezos as the richest person. On the other hand, as someone that has always worked very hard to pay as little taxes as possible, trying to make best use and leverage the contradictions of the US taxation system, and during the middle of the pandemic, more than once he has made comments and has taken choices that have sort of highlighted some degree of skepticism over the gravity of COVID. So on the one hand, this is a person that has been shaping the future of a key component of our daily life, which is automobiles. On the other, is someone that seemed to be less keen, at least on the surface of things, than others in terms of paying his fair dues back to society, and certainly has had somewhat of a risk-prone attitude towards one of the plagues of the last couple of years. So he's very much that controversial person, and perhaps Times is right to put him there, because at least the many reasons why he remains very controversial will continue to make all of us debate the key issues in societies today.
Yeah, absolutely. Alessio, thank you very much indeed. That was Alessio Patalano, and this is The Globalist.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
Now let's get a roundup of the week's most interesting urbanism stories with the urbanist and regular Monocle 24 contributor, Kat Hanna. Good morning to you, Kat.
Good morning.
This first story looks absolutely fascinating. London's bike lanes and urban myths. Tell us more.
Yes, so I imagine a few listeners may have caught the story that was doing the rounds in the media last week, essentially stating that London was now the most congested city in the world, and the reason for that was cycle lanes, particularly those that were brought in at the same time as the pandemic. And this is an article by someone at The Guardian who's done a little bit of digging just really to get into that study and see where that claim about cycle lanes being the cause actually really came from, and thinks it's probably not all that robust.
So tell us more, because, I mean, it does seem that it, in fact, was just made up.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't quite say made up, but the interesting bit that the article does flag is in the actual report produced by this research company themselves, who are themselves kind of, they sell traffic data, that's what they do. It didn't actually mention bikes at all in the whole report, nor was it actually global. So this kind of, claim that it was London was the worst in the world also seems somewhat far-fetched. So it seems to be a bit of a quote that was given, that once it had got out, it made the good headlines, and it went on and on and on. And, as the article highlights, it was kind of used again in an article at the weekend. And this idea of, once the myth is kind of out, it tends to keep on going, and actually quite how damaging that can sometimes be, especially in what is often quite a divisive, area of discussion, such as the role of bike lanes, on London streets.
And does The Guardian have any accurate figures on how much bike lanes do contribute to congestion?
The article hasn't gone into that, but what it does kind of state quite nicely is, again, I think the quote that led to this idea that, bike lanes mean more traffic is that traffic is just about supply and demand. So if you have, more lanes, you have less supply. But actually, that's not really the case, because, with traffic, you have this idea of kind of induced demand, which often actually means that the more that you add roads, the more that cars come and keep filling them. It's almost a bit like water. So it does actually say that the logic that states that cycles would cause that, and that's kind of, again, at the basis of this quote of supply and demand for use of roads, just isn't really true.
Yeah. And of course, what we should all be doing is taking the train. Now, one station that appears to be under threat is Penn Station in New York. Tell us about this Bloomberg piece, which is talking about preservationists and Penn Station.
Yeah, so this is a Bloomberg City Lab piece looking at kind of slightly evolving proposals for the redevelopment of Penn Station in New York. And these are proposals that kind of started under Governor Cuomo. They've now been inherited by the new governor. And whilst they've been scaled down a bit, they're still relatively dramatic in terms of, demolition of some existing historic buildings, adding of, skyscrapers above and around the station. What's quite interesting here is whilst it's a station that is generally seen as, pretty unpopular, it's kind of compared to a bit of a rat run, it's very subterranean in all kind of senses, there is a feeling now that actually it should be preserved. Because actually, I think what's being proposed as development is maybe seen as being a bit too much. It's not integrating with what's around it enough. So in a bit of a last-ditch attempt to stop that kind of full-scale redevelopment, a number of kind of protesters have essentially kind of historically listed it, which will obviously slow down that process.
Yeah. So what is the grand plan for it?
Well, the article, again, doesn't go too much into that, but I think what's quite interesting is it does often show how in many stages, history repeats itself. is a funny thing. In the original Penn station that was built in 1910 and then was later demolished in the 60s, was seen actually, that demolition, again, was seen as a bit of a crime that, they'd lost a lot of kind of, architectural history. And it was actually that demolition that launched this same preservation movement that is now being used again to stop the demolition of what was initially, well, that still is in many ways, a very unpopular rebuild as well. So there's, I guess, a question to which, are these preservation movements, is this more about using a tool? Is it more just about having a bit more of a conversation about the process to say, actually, there are some bits here in terms of context that are good, that do work, and let's not maybe throw the baby out with the bathwater in terms of this whole-scale redevelopment.
Kat, thank you very much indeed. That was the urbanist Kat Hanna, and this is The Globalist on Monocle 24. Finally, Christmas is the time of year associated with twinkling lights and general merriment, but it also goes hand in hand with dark nights and sinister apparitions. In literature and on screen, the ghost story has long been a seasonal fixture. To find out why this is the case, Monocle's senior correspondent Robert Bounds spoke to arts journalist Andrew Mail and Tanya Kirk, a curator at the British Library and the editor of anthologies Spirits of the Season and Chill Tidings, Dark Tales of the Christmas Season. He started off by asking Tanya why it is that Christmas is such an eerie time of year and what draws us to the ghost story.
When I was researching for these collections of books, I really struggled to kind of find the absolute answer for this. And I think it was because I was looking at it in the wrong way. So I kept thinking, when did ghost stories start being published? But actually, you need to kind of go back to oral traditions, and that's really where they come from. And we know that people were telling ghost stories right back in like the 17th century and before then, but they weren't fiction in the way that we know it today. And the reason why there's this huge boom of ghost stories in the 19th century and later is because basically the short story gets invented as a form.
And ghost stories, I suppose, lend themselves so well to that structure of it. And
Exactly. Yeah. They're like it's a kind of confined story that suits being short form, and it works really well. And then you get people like, so Dickens is obviously the most kind of famous proponent of ghost story and really popularised it.
I feel like he maybe is in the room. That old elephant.
So Christmas Carol comes out in 1843, and then he was the editor of these two kind of fiction periodicals, Household Words and All the Year Round, and they serialised fiction stories. So you'd have like a story that would appear, it was like a soap opera really, that'd appear over loads of months. But at Christmas, he used to produce these kind of special issues that were like gift issues, that the idea being that people would give them to family members for Christmas. So you couldn't have your serial stories in them because people would only have that one issue and it would be pointless.
So this is your sort of Christmas annual thing? This is the bumper edition.
Exactly.
And these would be one-off stories?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So ghost stories were really perfect for that. So that's kind of one reason, I think, why they become really associated with publishing at Christmas. But as to why they were told around the fire, I think that's like a whole other thing, and it comes into like the idea that it's the darkest point of the year and this kind of spirits walking and
the shortest day is just before Christmas, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
So we're in that realm of ultimate darkness, I suppose, aren't we?
I suppose also it is the death of the year, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's the time in which you kind of take stock, which is kind of ironic at the moment, take stock of the ones that you've lost and what you've lost and prepare for rebirth. And I suppose there's it's less verifiable, isn't it? But things like ancient festivals like the Yule Festival and things like that, that are associated with death and sacrifice and a notion of rebirth. But I also like the idea that it's the time when, the veil between worlds is at its thinnest.
Yes.
That it's a time when the dead have access to the living, when they can cross over. So when you're combining that with that kind of time where families gather and everyone gets together, and then, hang on, there's more people in this room than we invited. There are other presences here that have crossed over for this particular time of the year. And I think it's kind of what Tanya says. You can't just focus on one reason. You have to bring all of those in, which I think is one of the reasons that makes it so fascinating. Yeah, that it's this kind of collection of ancient tradition and then sort of but also kind of the industrial sort of product of the the magazine periodical and the short story, and also an editor, Charles Dickens, obsessed with ghost stories, and as a commissioning editor, commissioning ghost stories all the time. So
I love that. I love Dickens as commissioning editor.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll pitch it to Dickens, see what he says.
It's a ghost story. It's in.
Exactly. Exactly. It's a win-win with Dickens at the helm, with Dickens on the masthead. So we're coming to an understanding that we all kind of know why ghost stories feel right, but putting your finger on the exact sort of crux of why they're so suitable. I think you mentioned it in the introduction, Tanya, to Chill Tidings, the second of those three anthologies of spooky Christmas stories, about the Industrial Revolution and perhaps people moving from the countryside to the city, and maybe some sort of, not a pagan yearning, but a yearning for simpler things and storytelling and things like that. Spooky stories set in urban settings were only sort of became, to my knowledge, a 20th century thing. That kind of, they were mostly things that were sort of set on moors and in sort of churchyards and country houses and things. I suppose we're sort of in that realm most of the time in Christmas ghost stories, aren't we?
Yeah, I think that's back to the fact that when people used to tell these stories around the fire before they were written down, and it was very much an oral tradition, they were kind of seen as like semi-factual, and they were about your local area and the ghosts that lived there.
My ghost better than your ghost.
Exactly.
Sort of a regional playoff. Okay.
I suppose, and I think you've mentioned it before, Tanya, this idea of the rise of the literate middle classes as well. That kind of that something to read becomes, a sign of that you've kind of arrived. You're a reader and you've got your little collection of stories, but also you associate with a rise in leisure time as well. That you kind of you have got time. You're not just getting home from working in the fields, being knackered and then falling asleep. You get home, you sit in your chair by the fire and you read a story to yourself.
And also it's the invention of commuting.
Yes. So. That's a really good point. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So again, it was that kind of thing was perfect for that.
Yeah.
I think the other thing that I find really interesting is the fact that when people want to feel cosy, they want to read something that's absolutely not cosy. And there's this really brilliant quote from Jerome K. Jerome in his story Told After Supper, which is, so he says, "Nothing satisfies us on Christmas Eve but to hear each other tell authentic anecdotes about spectres. It is a genial festive season, and we love to muse upon graves and dead bodies and murders and blood."
Merry Christmas.
Thank you very much there to Tanya Kirk and Andrew Mail. They were speaking to Monocle's Robert Bound, and you can hear the full interview in this week's episode of Monocle on Culture. And that's all for today's programme. Thanks to our producers, Rhys James, Paige Reynolds and Charlie Filmer-Court, our researchers, Sophie Monaghan-Coombs and Lillian Fawcett, and our studio manager, Sam Impey. After the headlines, there's more music on the way. I'll be with you playing a selection from our global playlist and introducing more sharp programming. The briefing is live at midday in London. Marcus Hippie in the presenter's chair, looking at, amongst other issues, Russian nuclear weapons. We'll get the papers reviewed by Juliet Lindley from our Zurich studio, and Guy Delaunay looks at the redevelopment of the Albanian capital, Tirana. So that's all coming up at midday. The Globalist returns at the same time tomorrow with Chris Chermak. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thanks for listening.